And welcome back to this edition of Virtual Giuliani, where we continue our discussion of World War II in 1944. And in our last video, we talked all about the D-Day landings, the Normandy invasion, Operation Overlord, the greatest, the largest amphibious invasion in world history. And in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about the months that follow. Typically, sometimes in the history books referred to as D-Day plus. That's what they would refer to these days as. So in other words, there was D-Day, June 6, 1944. Well, then June 7th, 1944 was D-Day plus 1, and then D-Day plus 2, and then you can see how it would go on from there. So following D-Day, the Allies had established that beachhead. It cost them a tremendous amount of lives and resources, but they had been successful in securing a foothold in France. And of course, they were also bringing over the mulberries, bringing over more and more supplies. Eventually, men, troops, armor, you name it, started to pour into France from southern England. So that the days that follow, you'll see some really, really heavy fighting. The Allies now have the beachhead, but they need to break out into the rest of France. And it wasn't easy. The Germans fought extremely hard. The German reserves, especially the panzers, were finally brought into the fight. The terrain in northern France is somewhat difficult to fight in. They have these things known as hedgerows, which are sort of like these giant tree bush type things, and you laugh at that and you think, well, how can that stop a tank? But these are very, very old, and the roots go down into the ground really deep, and so it made it really hard to move armor around. It also made it really easy for the Germans to hide. You didn't know who was around the next hedgerow, and so it took the Allies some time to adjust to that. They even had to come up with some special accessories to put on their tanks to kind of cut through some of those hedgerows. So as the Allies try to break out of the beachhead, there's some serious fighting. There's fighting all over the place that's there. The Allied troops in the days that follow D-Day continue to push into France, even though the fighting is really hard. The British troops were trying to take what's known as the city of Caen. It took them a very, very long time to do that. The Americans were up in northern France at a place called Cherbourg, which was another vital port, another way to bring in troops and supplies and things like that. Eventually, the Americans take Cherbourg and they launch what's called Operation Cobra. And the majority of the German defenders had been in the city of Caen, which is why the British had such a difficult time taking it. So when the Americans launch Operation Cobra, they start to break out. They start to break out across the French countryside. The German defense starts to break up. The Americans had a lot of success in using air power to destroy the panzers. P-51s, other aircraft like that, heavy machine gun fire. The Germans were never able to really blitzkrieg back across France as the air cover and the relentlessness of Operation Cobra. So slowly but surely, eventually the British take Caen. The Americans are capturing other areas in France, northwestern France, in Operation Cobra. And by August of 1944, so think about June 6th, now it's August 1944, Allied troops enter the capital of France, which of course is Paris. And if you remember, Paris had been occupied for over 4 years by the Germans. Very early on in World War II, like we talked about, the French just sort of gave up and let the Germans roll in to save the city of France. No one has ever been able to definitively prove this. Some historians think this is true. Some historians think it is not true. But the old story went like this, that as the Germans were retreating from Paris, Hitler gave the order to the commander to destroy the city, and the German commander refused to destroy Paris, refused to burn it down, and save the city. And there's some historical controversy as to whether that really happened. I like to think it happened because Paris is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. If you ever get a chance to go there, definitely put that on your bucket list. But needless to say, there wasn't heavy fighting within Paris like you see in a lot of these other cities that destroyed the city. So the city was still in great shape. The French resistance fighters helped the Allied forces. and the Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle also landed. And so by August, after D-Day, Paris is liberated. You see the joy, the excitement, the parade that's taking place. You also see during this time, right after D-Day, that most people in Germany, most German generals realize there is no way Germany's going to win this war. And so some of them start to think about how to remove Hitler. Their thought process was if they could remove Hitler, show the Allies that they're not all like Hitler, that maybe the Allies would give them better peace terms. And so there was a plot in July of 1944 to assassinate Hitler. It was called Operation Valkyrie, and one of the main folks involved in this was this fella here. His name was Stauffenberg. Stauffenberg had fought in North Africa. He'd been wounded. He was sent to Berlin, and he had grown disenchanted with what Hitler was doing. He had gotten hooked up with some other folks that felt the same way, and they created this situation where they were going to kill Hitler and then use that to their advantage to literally launch a coup and take over Germany. And it almost worked. Stauffenberg got into Hitler's bunker in East Prussia. They called it the Wolf's Den, and he brought in with him a briefcase full of high explosives. He put the high explosives under a table not too far from Hitler and left. The bomb went off. You can see the damage. It killed some people, hurt some people, and unfortunately, it did not kill Hitler. It injured him slightly. He tried to launch his coup, but Hitler survived, and within a few hours, the truth was out. Stauffenberg and the rest of the conspirators were rounded up. Some of them were shot. Others were hung by piano wire. Pretty awful stuff that's there. So the plot to kill Hitler didn't work. Had they killed him, who knows how the war might have ended. Maybe not as great for Germany, but it certainly would have saved thousands and thousands of lives towards the end of the conflict. Also, on a side note, we say goodbye to Rommel, the Desert Fox. After D-Day, he had actually been wounded by an Allied aircraft, had strafed or machine gunned his car, and then Hitler convinced him to kill himself, commit suicide, rather than facing a firing squad. Hitler blamed him for losing the Battle of Normandy. So pretty bleak stuff there. Also, after D-Day, one of the things you see is the Germans trying to use advanced technology to their advantage. The Germans all throughout the war tried to make the best technology possible, and they had the best fortifications, they had the best tanks. They are the first country to develop jet engines that were there. They are the first country to start to use rockets. In fact, they had a scientific community led by this man here. His name is Wernher von Braun. And if that name sounds familiar, it should. Wernher von Braun actually became one of the men who worked on NASA's moon program, the Apollo program. After the war, he comes to the United States and basically helps us start our space program. Long story short, during World War II, Wernher von Braun and his folks were building rockets that could attack, and missiles that could attack Great Britain and even beyond. And so by the summer of 1942, he had developed what were known as the V1 and V2 rockets. They called them vengeance weapons. The V1 was known as the buzz bomb because it made this sort of buzzing sound. It had a rocket and engine on the back and kind of flew in like an airplane, like a flying bomb. They start to rain down on London in the summer of 1944, causing all sorts of damage. Eventually, the British figure out how to shoot those things down. You could set up a Spitfire, you could shoot it down, or you could tip its wings and make it crash. But the next generation, the V2, was far more deadly. The V2, you see right here, is the first human-designed machine that actually leaves the atmosphere. It's the world's first ballistic missile. So the Germans could fire this thing off. It would leave the atmosphere. It would screech back down over 1,000 miles an hour. Impossible to stop. And in the tip of that missile is a huge bomb. The British started calling them blockbusters. That's where we get the term blockbuster from, because when these bombs went off, it would literally destroy a block of London. And these were causing a huge problem, just like the Blitz had. after D-Day. The Germans were firing these things off from northern France, from Belgium, Netherlands, towards London on a pretty significant basis. And so defeating them required the Allies to capture their launch sites because with the V2, there was no way to shoot it down. There was no way to really, really stop it. And so you see that. Had the Germans developed these sooner, had they been able to mass produce these, it really could have been a game changer, a war changer. The Germans had factories built into mountains, lots of slave labor. We'll talk more about the Holocaust later on, but they used a lot of Jewish slave labor inside of these mountains to produce the V2s, and then they would roll them out and fire them off. So the Allies had to capture those facilities, usually on the ground, to make those missiles stop. The good news is that by that point in the war, Germany didn't have the materials, didn't have the logistics to mass produce them like they would have years prior. And that is one of the reasons why they never really were that useful and effective on the battlefield. Even though they were super high tech, far more high tech than anything else the Allies had, they just couldn't put enough of them into production. That being said, there is an Allied operation that tries to grab hold of the Netherlands, grab hold of some of those launch sites, and find a quick way into Germany. It is known as Operation Market Garden. It takes place in the fall of 1944, and for the most part, it's a failure. It was designed by Montgomery, who, of course, was the British general, and his idea was not only can we stop the launch sites for the V2s, but we can also find a quick way into Germany. The Germans, along the German border with Holland and Belgium, had really fortified that area. It wasn't quite as fortified as something like the Maginot Line, but it was pretty fortified. They called it the Siegfried Line. They were bunkers, tank traps, barbed wire, landmines, you name it. And the Allies figured if we try to go through that Siegfried Line, it's going to be a bloodbath. So Montgomery was hoping he could find this little narrow corridor through Holland into Germany and around the Siegfried Line. You kind of see it on the map there. The operation used a lot of airborne troops that really didn't work. The Germans counterattacked, and the Operation Market Garden was more or less a failure. Speaking of German counterattacks, the other thing that we see at the very end of 1944 is that Germany launches a counteroffensive. All right, so by June 1944, the Allies set up the beachhead in Normandy. They start to break out Operation Cobra across France. They liberate Paris. They start to roll into eastern France, Luxembourg, Belgium. And during that time, the Germans are devising a counterassault. Panzers, armored troop carriers, infantry, you name it. And they catch the Allies completely by surprise. And they attack through the Ardennes. You might remember the Ardennes was the forested, hilly area that the Germans originally invaded France through. While they attack through the Ardennes, they catch the troops, the American and British troops, by surprise, and they create a bulge in the American lines. They start to push us back into France. They surround the 101st Airborne that was in a city known as Bastogne. And it looks like the Germans' counteroffensive might just hold off the Allies from entering Germany. Again, heavy fighting, lots of casualties. Patton, even though it's snowing and miserable in December of 44, actually rolls his Third Army into Bastogne to save the 101st Airborne. The 101st Airborne was surrounded, and the Germans told them to surrender, and the American commander of the 101st Airborne told them, no, we're not going to surrender, and he just replied with the word nuts. And of course, the Germans had no idea what that meant, and Patton came and rescued him, and it's a really great story. But long story short, by the end of 1944, it's not clear that the Allied forces are going to be able to get into Germany very easily. Operation Market Garden had failed. Now the bulge had been created, and the winter weather is setting in. However, by February 1945, as we'll talk about later on, the Battle of Bulge is over, the Germans lose, and the doorway to Germany is wide open. On the other side of the war. Obviously, we have the Allies coming across France and the Low Countries. We also have that Soviet steamroller continuing to roll across Eastern Europe. The Red Army had more or less pushed the Germans out of what was the Soviet Union by the end of 1944, and they were looking at pushing further and further towards Germany, which of course required going through Eastern Europe and other countries such as Poland. So the Soviets now were looking at, all right, how can we roll through this area? They are retooling, they're getting their tanks ready, tanks prepared, and in the meantime, they're also broadcasting to the people of Poland, hey, now is the time to rise up. And so there is what's called the Warsaw Uprising, where the people of Poland who had been living under German rule for so many years finally rise up. They start to fight with the Germans. They also seek a democracy, which of course Stalin isn't going to stand for. So Stalin basically allows the Poles to fight, get a good foothold against the Germans. Eventually, though, the Warsaw Uprising is put down. The Poles are able to weaken the Germans, but Stalin doesn't help them. He allows the Germans to beat up on the democracy forces in Poland, and then eventually, by 1945, in the beginning of 1945, he rolls the Red Army in and takes over the country. Stalin wanted to ensure that Germany would never invade Russia again or the Soviet Union again, and so he had his eye on all of these Eastern European countries as a buffer zone. And Poland was obviously one of the more important ones, so he allowed the Polish uprising, the Warsaw Uprising, to do most of the dirty work. Didn't help him, and then that way he could roll in and avoid any type of democracy. That being said, Churchill decides, well, I better go talk to Uncle Joe, as he called him, because we don't want a bunch of communist countries all across Eastern Europe, and we don't know where Stalin will stop if he continues to steamroll. So he makes a deal, unknown to the Americans, with Stalin at the end of 1944, that basically the Soviets can take over Eastern Europe. The British are going to have influence in Greece as the war sort of grinds to an end, the end of 1944, beginning in 1945. And that will have serious, serious consequences for the world following World War II as we enter into the Cold War. So that's where we end up at the end of 1944 in the European campaign. In our next video, we'll talk about what's going on in the Pacific. I hope that helps. Hope everybody's doing well. We'll see you next time on Virtual Gigliotti.